This is my new book. It's called The New Media Invasion, and it's my fourth book. I just received copies of it in the mail a couple of days ago, and I just thought I'd make a quick little video here and to inform the public about it, a little bit of self-promotion. I was inspired to write the book by wondering, the thought occurred to me, I wondered what McLuhan would have thought about all the new media, especially the internet, but also gadgets that have come along in the 90s, like the cell phone, the digital camera, and handheld devices and so forth. I wondered what he would have said about all the new media, and since there aren't too many individuals who around these days anymore who are as erudite as he was, I figured I would go ahead and give it a shot and kind of take a McLuhan-esque media studies approach to all of this digital revolution. So that's what this book is about and what I've done. Now, the digital revolution is something that came about, I draw the line at about 1995, which seems as good a year as any because that's the year when the internet was released to the public sector. The NSF had it up to that point, and they turned it over to the public sector. And then it began to boom, and about the same time cell phones began to come into popularity, digital cameras, Blackberries, portable devices, and we got this whole digital explosion, all of this stuff coming out around us. And within the space of about 15 years, we're now 15 years on into this digital revolution, the entire world of traditional Gutenbergian printed media has more or less imploded under the impact of this light speed, everything all at once coming at you from all directions, real-time media, digital media. So we're looking at a major media extinction event. In geological history, there have been 5 great extinction events. The one that killed off the dinosaurs 65 million years ago was the last such event. And we're seeing something similar now in the media landscape with what's going on with all these new digital gadgets, the impact that it's making. Newspapers are closing down, magazines have been closing down, Tower Records is gone, Borders Books is gone, many retail stores have gone, shopping malls themselves are in trouble, the post office is now even in trouble as a result of the internet. All of these things are collapsing and discomposing into a new kind of rubble heap that has contributed to a shabby, shambling economy that has become rickety, and all these media are vanishing rapidly. And I think it's something that's a cause for great concern. Now, when the printing press came along in the 15th century, its effects also were quite titanic. It was a big deal. And some of the trauma that the printing press inflicted on that society is recorded in the plays of Shakespeare. You see this in King Lear and in Hamlet. There's a new kind of disorientation that those plays record. McLuhan points this out in his books, about the new kinds of visually biased linear three-dimensional space that was configured at that time. Now, medieval culture was based on a kind of haptic, tactile, acoustic, auditory culture. The visual sense was not stepped up, it was integrated with the other senses. You got illuminated manuscripts that were very tactile, very tangible, very concrete, and when the printing press came along, it happened to coincide with the advent of depth perspective in painting, which came in the same century, in the 15th century, and that began to configure a new kind of space that is visually biased. That is to say that the visual sense is stepped up away from the other senses, and a new kind of space is configured that's entirely three-dimensional. And all objects are subordinated to this one single space, and we think that's normal and natural, that's the way space is. But in fact, it's a cultural bias. Space is configured differently in every culture. And typically in ancient cultures, in Egypt, for example, if you look at their works of art, you see the pharaoh, for example, is the largest character in the relief work. Other individuals in marching in armies are the size of very small figures beside him. So they don't exist in the same space. Space is discontinuous. Pharaoh is enlarged in accordance with his spiritual power. And so the space is discontinuous there. It's not, all the figures are not subordinated to the same all-encompassing space as they are in Renaissance art. For the first time in history, we get this idea of space as an empty container to which all objects are subordinated. It's an ocular culture. It's a culture that came out of the culture of the scholastics that invented eyeglasses and lenses and were fascinated with optics. And they honed their intellect to a keen edge with the scholastic philosophers, Thomas Aquinas and company. And the printing press rather came out of that entire world. It was very consistent with it. but it was also favoring the I above the other senses. It was also traumatic, and it took a while for them to adjust. Probably by the, Don Quixote is another 1600, as another text where you see that this is traumatic, this shift between one world and the next. And so nowadays we're undergoing a similar kind of trauma with the internet. It's completely disorienting, and we get works of art that record that disorientation, like, for example, Cormac McCarthy's novel The Road, in which a major apocalypse has happened. We're not told what the apocalypse is, whether it was a comet, a meteorite, or a nuclear war has happened, and the father is leading his son through a devastated country, and it's basically a journey without a goal. And the apocalypse there is really metaphoric for the trauma that has happened to us now with the internet and digital culture. It has traumatized us, and our artists and poets pick up on this trauma subliminally, and that's what their works of art are about. They fathom these dimensions in shifting realms of being. They're sensitive to it, they pick it up, and they translate it into visual and narrative form. So The Road is one example. There are other examples, Don DeLillo's novel Cosmopolis, and so forth. But this book here, The New Media Invasion, chronicles the effects of this internet transformation. One of the structural characteristics of the internet, one of the things that it does, for instance, is it scales up the power of the individual asymmetrically. WikiLeaks is a classic example of this, where Julian Assange is a single individual, and because he goes through the internet, it's as though he were putting on a Manichaean armor of light that scales him up to the size of a gigantic figure who is now capable, wearing his armor of light, of going to war against entire governments. He's more or less gone to war against the United States government. This may be the first example in history of a single individual going up against an entire government, going to war. There was another episode in 2007 when a Russian kid, Konstantin Goloskokov, took on the government of Estonia single-handedly and basically hacked in and caused big problems for the government there. So the internet scales up the power of the individual asymmetrically. Basically, these internet sites like YouTube and Google and Wikipedia are really disguised individuals. Wikipedia really is Jimmy Wales. It's just him hiding behind it. Larry Page and Sergey Brin are Google. And Chad Hurley was originally YouTube, and so forth. These are really individuals disguised. They're institutions unto themselves. And so another thing that these gadgets do, YouTube itself is interesting because it represents a new kind of Gesamtkunstwerk of media, a totalizing form of media into which all previous media have been dumped, visual electronic media, that is, have been dumped, the same way the entire history of media was enabled with the printing press to be enclosed within the pages of a book. YouTube has done this now for the entire history. Everything from old commercials to movies to you name it, anything that's been filmed has been dumped into YouTube as an all-encompassing media. So every medium that comes along actually, as McLuhan said, becomes the content of a new medium. So old media become the content of new media. And the content of YouTube are all the old electronic media. The same way, for example, film, the content of film when it came along was actually the old novel. And the content of the printing press, when first books were printed, the content of that were the illuminated manuscripts that preceded it, and so forth. So that's the media cycle. And other things these new gadgets do, like for example, video games are interesting. I've got a chapter on video games in there as well, which talks about how the video games also scale up the power of the individual. They do something very interesting in that they retrieve the archetype of the great epic warrior. And they cast the individual who plays them in the role of an epic warrior who is capable now, via the electronic medium of the video game itself, of effecting a new world for himself. In today's modern world, I mean, the individual has been scaled down to such a degree that he or she basically feels helpless. Most of the decisions are made by vast, impersonal governments and multinational corporations, and the individual has been scaled down to the level of a bug, just like in Kafka's Metamorphosis, and no longer feels effective. And what video games do, though, is they give the individual back the power to undo the social codes that have been imprinted upon him, and he is enabled thereby to trace a line of flight through the electronic labyrinth, undo the codes, and feel empowered. World of Warcraft is another example of this retrieval of the great epic hero. The individual is epic hero who can amount to something and who is capable of participating in the creation of cosmologies. It renders power back to the individual. So that's what video games do, and that's what the video game essay in here talks about. But anyway, these are some of the main ideas in the book. I go through, and there are different chapters on YouTube, Amazon.com, WikiLeaks. There's a chapter on Wikipedia, which I regard as a knowledge catastrophe. The chapter on Wikipedia, for example, discusses how the knowledge catastrophe of Wikipedia is that it purports to create an encyclopedia, but it's actually not an encyclopedia because it's an unstable database of shifting information. If you go into a database and you look up an article and you want to know what current consensus thought is about a subject, say Napoleon, and if you go in there and you read the facts and then you go back and check on those facts again later and they're not there because someone has mysteriously come along meantime and deleted them, what you have there is not a knowledge database at all, and it can't masquerade as one. It's not an encyclopedia. It's basically a glorified rumor mill. The knowledge on Wikipedia, because it's so unstable and disappears, is basically a form of rumor, something that's more akin to the ontological status of rumor. And so it's a kind of knowledge crisis. Wikipedia cannot be relied upon as a knowledge database. So that's the essay on Wikipedia. There's an essay in there on Facebook too, which discusses how Facebook flattens us all out into icons, similar to what happened with celebrities. I wrote a previous book about celebrities that talked about how the descent into electronic culture creates two-dimensional iconic personalities that are flattened cliches and stereotypes that cause an agon in the celebrity's life, because the real celebrity, after all, is a three-dimensional individual, and the agon of the misalignment between the two-dimensional icon and the real person becomes the tragedy of the celebrity's life, particularly the tragic celebrity who succumbs to drugs and alcohol, and the tragedy ends up destroying them because of the cognitive noise that it generates. In a similar way, Facebook democratizes this creation of electronic avatars, two-dimensional trading cards. It reduces each person to a kind of two-dimensional trading card, flattens the person out. And another thing that it does is it retrieves neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are now disappearing. They've long since disappeared, actually, in many of our societies due to urban sprawl and the automobile that has come along and completely destabilized these cities, stretched them out elastically such that you have to get in your car, as one does in a place like Phoenix or Los Angeles, to drive up to your nearest coffee shop. Well, Facebook retrieves the phatic environment. What communication theorists call phatic communication is just social communication. It's not communication that communicates any kind of useful knowledge at all. It's just you say, hi, hey there. It's that kind of communication. And Facebook retrieves that kind of phatic communication that used to be found in the days when we would go strolling up the streets and say hi to all our neighbors. Those days are gone. Facebook retrieves that. So all these new media are doing something. They're retrieving older forms of discourse and communication, and they're flattening them out, two-dimensionalizing them, and putting them into cyberspace, which is, it's a center that is everywhere, dispersed without circumference. And so this is what the new media invasion has done. I'm ambivalent about it. I like it. I use it. I'm not a technophobe, but I also think it's done a lot of damage. We've given up a lot of media in order to make this new revolution take place and in order to configure ourselves to it, and we're not given much choice. We have to either come along with this and adapt to it, or fall by the wayside and live in a shack somewhere. So we're not given too much in the way of choice. But that's what this book is about. It's meant to chronicle the stresses of this shifting in sensibilities from one epoch to another.